one of the largest and most influential investigative journalism outfits around the world that you've probably never heard of is called OCCRP. That's short for Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Now, OCCRP has been instrumental in some of the biggest kind of global scoops that you probably have heard of. Some of those are called Swiss leaks, Panama Papers, Pandora Papers. These are collaborative journalistic projects that involve news organizations like Le Monde, Der Spiegel, the Washington Post, The Guardian, like the biggest names around the world. But the muscle for a lot of these projects has been the organization OCCRP, which has more than 200 journalists around the world operating in at least 60 countries. They're the ones that really put the meat behind these stories that then get published in major papers around the country. We have a new investigation up at DropSiteNews, we can put up on the screen here, which reveals for the first time that more than 50% of the funding from OCCRP comes from the United States government, and the bulk of that coming from USAID. The first important grant that went to OCCRP was from a law enforcement agency within the State Department. Now, we will put the link to the full story here at the notes of this article. We'll put it down in the comments, and always, of course, if you're not getting our emails yet over at DropSiteNews, go to dropsitenews.com. Sign up to get those. We can put up this next element. We worked in collaboration with three independent news outlets over in Europe, and you can read more about them in the article that we have linked down here. And in order to find the details of this funding, we didn't actually need anybody to leak this or to blow a whistle. What we had to do is find the audit reports that are on file, that are available publicly, and cross-reference them with federal budget documents. And it was a rather painstaking process, but the result is what you see here. Our calculation was that more than 50% of the money ended up coming from the United States government. Now, when we went to OCCRP for comment, one quibble they had with our methodology is they said that you should not actually count federal government money that is given to OCCRP, that OCCRP then sends on to sub-grantees. Okay, I kind of think you should count that, but if you exclude that money, you are still left with 46% of the funding coming from the United States government. Now, that also sets aside the fact that the UK and other major Western powers in Europe also contribute money to OCCRP, something like roughly $15 million over the last 10 years, on top of what the U.S. is already sending. So, why does this matter? Well, from the one hand, Emily, I'm curious for your take on this. You could say, look, it's very difficult to fund investigative journalism, and investigative journalism is important. And the argument that OCCRP makes is that there are no kind of serious strings attached to this money because the United States stands for freedom and democracy and the free press, and it is in America's interest for there to be investigative journalism around the world, and so they fund it with a clean hands-off approach. And you can just, any product of that is going to be beneficial to the world because investigative journalism is good, corruption is bad, and the U.S. supports, the U.S. supports that entire process. Now, the one detail counter argument to that is that when the federal government gives money to an organization, it does actually come with strings. And one of the some of them are silly, like. Not silly, but trivial, like the journalists have to fly American Airlines. Not American Airlines itself, but an American airline if it's possible. Okay, that's kind of funny. But that's not actually harming the journalism. The other string that comes attached is that the U.S. government can veto the top hires of the organization, which is a pretty significant one. And then on the other hand, there's the kind of the atmospheric, where you don't have to directly let an organization know what America's interest is in a particular country. Everybody already knows. And people know, like, if we're investigating, let's say, America's adversaries, that's going to be looked on fondly. If we're going after America's friends, that might come with consequences. Might not, but it might. And I'm sure that's in the back of people's minds. But I'm curious for your take on broadly what it means that this giant of journalism is actually majority funded by the U.S. government.
I mean, I think their excuse or their justification or their rationalization where they say, actually, if you crunch the numbers, it's only 46% of our funding is laughable, because to any person, if you explained that they are quietly half funded by the United States government, at the very least 46, necessarily, like you're pretty close to halfway funded at that point. Even getting a significant chunk of your funding from the United States government is meaningful when you are primarily chasing stories on foreign targets. And that's really important because, to your point, Ryan, you wrote in the story, it was a very fair and helpful story. They have gone after the United States government in certain reports. They have done things that may be unfavorable to the United States government. But if we're using taxpayer resources to intentionally muckrake on foreign adversaries, that's very worth knowing when you're considering the source of the reporting, and their denial-ish reminded me a little bit of what they said when, I know you remember this, the Cuban Twitter fiasco of like 2014 when USAID tried to create a, quote, Cuban Spring with like a Twitter in Cuba. They said, this is USAID. This is a comment to Time Magazine. They said, working to improve platforms of communication is a core part of what USAID works to do. It's inaccurate to say that the program goes beyond that. So their defense is really similar. That what they're doing is just improving communication. They're just furthering democracy via the free press. It's
with a bunch of bots in Cuba. Yeah, and the history is, I think, really important, and we go into it in detail in the story, but it goes back, interestingly, to the Philippines, where there was a nationalist leader there, Joseph Estrada, who had a standoffish relationship with the United States, because anybody who is a nationalist and is not just completely in the pocket of the United States is, by definition, going to have a standoffish relationship. And there was a nonprofit investigative outfit there in the Philippines that broke some significant corruption news around Estrada. That outlet has taken money from the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created in the 1980s to move the CIA's kind of underground clandestine funding of civil society. In Europe, for instance, post World War II, the CIA was funding Paris Review, and basically any cultural project in Europe was getting money from the CIA. That was exposed in the 1970s. It was embarrassing. So in the 1980s, they created NED, which is legally a nonprofit, but is almost exclusively funded by the U.S. government for these national security interest purposes.
And we've said as much.
Yeah, this is not a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy,
but it's not a theory.
it's done out in the open, and it's part of our foreign policy.
Right.
And it operates hand in glove with USAID. USAID was making the grants to NED, and NED would then send them to OCCRP and other places. And so this Philippine organization broke this news. It created an impeachment inquiry, which did not succeed in impeaching him, but it also created street protests. And the street protests eventually led to his ouster in a coup. Michael Henning was a State Department official who our consortium of news organizations interviewed for this article, in particular NDR, which is a German public broadcaster, interviewed him. And he said that when he was stationed in the Philippines, he saw the effectiveness of the pen being mightier than the sword, that being able to wield that investigative journalism against a geopolitical adversary was extremely powerful. And also, it gives the U.S. a deniability there. These are just the Philippine people standing up for the corruption that they have witnessed, and they want to clean it out. Henning then gets sent over to Bosnia, where he serves in the embassy over there, and he was instrumental in getting the initial funding and helping to set up OCCRP. He said that he connected Drew Sullivan, who was the founder of OCCRP and still runs it, with the editor of that Philippine paper, so that they could swap notes. Sullivan, who also gave an interview for this project, said that transitioning Eastern Europe, from a more kind of Soviet-leaning, Russia-friendly, state-centric type of economy to a neoliberal, Western-friendly, market-oriented, free of corruption economy was central to the spread of journalism in that region. So nobody really is denying at all that the mission here is the pursuit of U.S. national interest.
It's not novel. I mean, there's that quote that was given to David Ignatius in 1991 about how the NED, a lot of what they're doing overtly was done covertly by the CIA years ago. It was from Alan Weinstein, right?
Yeah.
It was, that's the government has said it openly. So it's not novel that the U.S. government would do this, which is why some of the denials are sort of funny. It's like, this is a practice of the United States for a long time, and that's where I thought your story hit on something really interesting about how the impeachment or the whistleblower, and this gets to Ukraine. So if you're on the right and you're not sort of like a dyed-in-the-wool adversary of the NED, which was supported by Reagan era sort of Cold Warriors and all those things, I mean, in all seriousness, like the problem with practices like this are pretty clear when you think about how in the whistleblower letter that led to the impeachment was used as part of the predicate for the impeachment of Donald Trump.
Not Australia.
Yes. The impeachment of Donald Trump, it immediately cited a report from
OCCRP.
the OCCRP. And you start to put that doesn't mean that what was in the report was wrong. But it does mean
there's a real wait a minute quality to it where you're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
The whistleblower letter to Congress about Donald Trump cited in its footnotes OCCRP reporting 4 times, and OCCRP is half funded by the federal government.
And then the CIA, there were CIA email addresses used in the organization of the letter to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop reporting, right? The CIA is not friendly to Donald Trump. The FBI is not friendly to Donald Trump. There have obviously been, the FBI was talking about a quote-unquote insurance policy against Donald Trump in 2016. And then the CIA, there's email addresses used by the CIA to organize the letter suggesting that the laptop was disinformation, leading to its suppression in the media. You put those pieces together and you think, what is the CIA potentially planting with friendly sources? And one of the things I thought your story was really helpful in elucidating was how these casual connections at USAID and reporters, even though they say we're not getting top-down directions about what's being planted or propaganda or what we need to write, it's just sort of like you're hired because you're on the same wavelength.
Right. Yeah, and also,
and we don't know. We don't know what's being talked about.
Right, and OCCRP, to its credit, I will say, does disclose their list of funders. Like, they will say we do get money from the State Department. Like, you can find that on their website. They've never said we get half our money from the State Department, but they have disclosed that they do get some money from the State. But when you're reading an article in the Washington Post or the Guardian, that was actually, that the meat of the reporting was done by OCCRP. As a reader, you don't know that this is heavily funded by the U.S. government because you're reading it in the Washington Post or the Guardian. So it's a way to launder it back through. And we talk at the very end of the story about the obvious counterexample to the idea that the U.S. just loves global investigative reporting, which people watching this have probably in their minds, they're going to ding, wait a minute, hold on. The U.S. loves global investigative reporting. They love leaks.
Yes, love it.
They just love that. What about Wikileaks?
Love it so much.
Why do they really? So Wikileaks, which exposed enormous amounts of corruption in the Middle East and helped to spark the Arab Spring, was on the rise at a similar time as OCCRP, and the reaction and the posture of the United States government towards WikiLeaks. Now, obviously, there's some differences. WikiLeaks also deals in much more often in classified information. OCCRP is almost very rarely deals in classified information. They deal in huge caches of bank documents or other offshore financial operations will be the massive amounts of data will be leaked on that and exposing financial corruption, often of oligarchs and other U.S. adversaries. So there are differences between WikiLeaks and OCCRP, but WikiLeaks exposed massive corruption in the Middle East, helped lead to the Arab Spring. The response of the United States was relentless prosecution and persecution and attempts to extradite the publisher, Julian Assange, and ultimately convicting him of publishing classified information in this plea deal that let him go back to Australia. So completely different approaches.
Well, and if I'm misremembering this, you'll know better, but if I'm remembering correctly, in the similar way that there are conspicuous questions about Julian Assange and Russia, like were there things unfavorable to Russia that didn't come out in WikiLeaks? There are sort of similar questions about Pandora and Panama Papers, right? They're like it's sort of complicated, multi-layered.
Right. A lot of people are like, well, wait a minute. What about the stuff? Where's the good stuff on our oligarchs?
Yeah, it was a lot of it was heavy on the Russian oligarchs.
Yeah.
Right. Which is not journalism, by the way, if you have all of the information, right? If you have the information on all of the oligarchs in the data, and you're only publishing on the Russians.
Right, but they may have only had the information on the Russians.
Right, we don't know.
Where the heck did they get this stuff?
Yeah. Right, but we don't know, even though it's potentially being funded by our money.
Their sources just never seem to get exposed either.
Crazy stuff.
Yeah, but why can't the CIA find their sources?
It's a great story.
Interesting.
It was a great story, and you managed to, I think, break through on the right too.
Oh, good. I'm glad people are reading it. Yeah, so check it out. We'll put a link down there, but you can find it over at DropSiteNews.com, or you can find it at Mediapart, which is the French independent news organization. I forget the name of the Italian one. It's very Italian. And there's Reporters United, which is a Greek paper that we worked on it. We'll put links to all of them because it was a real thrill and privilege to work with all of these journalists. Stefania Marizzi, you may know, was the Italian journalist who worked on this, has done a lot of work on WikiLeaks. And hopefully we'll do more kind of collaborations with them and grow the network of independent news organizations around the world that are willing to take on these kinds of stories.
Maybe you'll get some money from the government. I don't think so.
I think we might have bitten that hand a little bit too hard.
Well, there's also the fact that you're already working for the CIA.
That's right.
Yeah. Never forget. Well, Ryan, great reporting. Great to be back here on the festive winter set. As we discussed all kinds of terrible things, it's nice to have the charming snowflakes behind us.
Yeah. And we will have a Counterpoints Friday, so come back on
Crazy
Friday.
one.
Very interesting one.
Crazy one.
Yes.
Yeah, looking forward to that. And the merch is back, by the way.
It is?
The holiday merch is back.
Oh,
so if you want our faces on stuff, pick it up. BreakingPoints.com.
See you later.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to BreakingPoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.